I never saw it coming. Grandpa had always been the quiet one at family gatherings, the kind of man who smiled more than he spoke, who fixed what was broken without making a scene. He wasn't flashy, or loud, or demanding. Just constant. That's why it stunned me when Dad said, "Let's keep things simple this year. Maybe don't invite Grandpa." I was sitting at the kitchen counter, half wrapping gifts, when the words hit me. Grandpa was being left out of Christmas, like an afterthought. But Grandpa didn't get angry. He didn't argue. He just smiled, nodded, and left. 2 days later, Dad received a letter. The mortgage? Canceled. And that's when I started realizing, maybe the strongest person in this family was the one we all underestimated. This is the story of how a quiet man reminded us what dignity really looks like without raising his voice. I'd always assumed Grandpa would be at Christmas. Not because we invited him formally, we never had to. He just belonged. He was always the first to arrive with a tin of his homemade peanut brittle and the last to leave after carefully stacking all the wrapping paper to recycle. He was part of the rhythm. A quiet presence humming beneath all the chaos. So when I overheard my dad talking to Mom in the hallway, my chest tightened before I even understood why. "It's better this way," Dad was saying. "He makes things awkward. You know how he insolent, staring. He won't even eat half the stuff Isabella cooks." Mom hesitated. "I just don't want the girls to feel bad. Emma's old enough to understand, and Olivia won't even notice. We deserve a peaceful holiday." I stood frozen, halfway down the stairs, gift ribbon dangling from my fingers. He wasn't invited. At first, I thought maybe it was a misunderstanding. Maybe they meant Grandpa was busy. But then Dad called Uncle Ray and said, "Hey, just a heads up, we're keeping it small this year. No, Dad. He'll understand." And that was it. A man who'd paid for the roof over our heads, who built the roof over his own son's head, was suddenly not part of the vibe anymore. I wanted to ask Dad why. Why exclude someone who had never asked for anything but respect? But there was this stiffness in his voice, a kind of finality I didn't recognize. So I stayed quiet. I wrapped presents. I made hot chocolate. I tried to pretend I didn't feel like something was unraveling under our feet. Christmas Eve came. The house was lit, the music played softly, and Mom's wine glasses clinked as she laid the table. There was roast lamb, garlic potatoes, and one empty seat at the end of the table that no one acknowledged. I texted Grandpa. "Hey, Grandpa, are you okay?" No reply. At 6:15, I looked out the window and saw headlights pulling away from the curb. Grandpa's car. He had driven over. Maybe just to look at the lights. Maybe just to say goodbye without saying anything at all. He didn't knock. He didn't call. He didn't even let us know he'd been there. He just left. That night, I couldn't sleep. There was something about the silence he left behind that felt louder than any family argument I'd ever heard. And I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted, that the quiet man we'd pushed aside wasn't walking away because he was weak. He was walking away because he knew exactly what he was doing. The next morning, I walked downstairs expecting to see some kind of conversation happening, maybe guilt in the air, maybe even regret. But Dad was sipping his coffee like nothing happened. He was humming to himself while scrolling through his phone, already talking about going to the post-Christmas sales. "We nailed it this year," he said to Mom. "Best Christmas in a decade." I stared at him, waiting for even a flicker of discomfort. Nothing. Mom looked at me and offered a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Do you want to help me start packing away the decorations?" I nodded, but inside, something curled tight and cold. Later that day, while helping bring down boxes from the hallway closet, I saw Grandpa's old wooden sleigh he made for Olivia and me when we were little. It hadn't been used in years, but we always kept it. "Let's donate it," Dad said without even glancing at it. "Takes up too much space." I swallowed my words. That evening, I went into the garage and opened the box of old family photos Grandpa had given me 2 years ago. Inside, there was one I always loved him and Grandma, sitting on the porch of their first house, holding baby Dad between them. Grandpa looked so young, proud, and full of something I couldn't quite name, like he knew what mattered and had already chosen it. I texted him again. "Hi, Grandpa. I saw you last night. I think you came by. Are you okay?" No response. Instead, the silence stretched. 2 days passed. Then, on the third morning, everything changed. I was pouring cereal when Dad walked in holding a crisp white envelope. He looked confused, like someone had just asked him a question in a language he didn't speak. "What's this?" he asked Mom. She shrugged. Didn't you order something? No, he said, frowning as he tore open the envelope. His face shifted within seconds. First confusion, then tension, then something close to panic. It's from the mortgage lender. Mom's brows furrowed. Is it bad? He didn't answer. He just handed her the letter. Her eyes scanned the page and then she looked up at him. They canceled the auto payments? Dad grabbed the envelope back like it might explain itself if he stared harder. But how? He's been making them for years. He didn't say Grandpa's name, but I knew. We all knew. And suddenly, the house didn't feel so warm anymore. No one spoke for a long minute. Dad sat down, hard. Mom hovered behind him. I watched their world, this polished, curated holiday image, crack like glass beneath their feet. Because the truth had finally arrived. Not with yelling, not with revenge. Just one envelope. Just one quiet exit. And the man they'd excluded had just pulled the foundation out from under everything they thought they controlled. That night, I couldn't sleep again. Not because I was angry, but because I kept hearing the silence from the kitchen. Not a word from Dad, not a single sentence about Grandpa, just the clinking of ice cubes in his glass and the low hum of the refrigerator. But the next morning, I heard them. My parents, in the hallway, whispering. I had cracked the door open just an inch, enough to hear everything. Do you think he told anyone? Mom's voice was sharp, nervous. I don't know, Dad muttered. But it's not just the mortgage. That was a bank-owned note. If he pulls back on the taxes and utilities, we can't afford to cover that right now, Paul. Don't you think I know that? I felt a chill run through me. They had built this life on Grandpa's money, his quiet generosity, and now that lifeline had been cut. Suddenly, Dad's loud confidence seemed more like a performance. One that only worked as long as Grandpa played his part in silence. Maybe we should just talk to him, Mom offered, softening her tone. Apologize. He's not going to listen. You saw what he did. He didn't say a word, just disappeared and cut the line. Because we didn't invite him to Christmas. Finally, the sentence spoken aloud. A heavy pause followed. I didn't think he'd actually go through with it, Dad whispered. You didn't think he'd stand up for himself, Mom corrected, her voice quieter now. You thought he'd just keep giving and never ask for anything back. Dad didn't answer. I closed my door and sat on the floor beside it. I suddenly felt like I was standing in a house built on secrets, on debts never acknowledged, on a version of love that had strings antecedently, not by Grandpa. No, his love was real, but it had been taken for granted. I thought of how many times I'd seen him hand Dad a folded check, or quietly fix things around the house, replacing the dishwasher, paying off a car loan as a gift, and I realized something awful. We never said thank you. We just assumed he'd always be there, that he didn't mind being left out as long as we smiled in pictures and called him on his birthday. But people like Grandpa, they notice everything. And when they stop giving, it's not out of spite. It's because they've finally accepted the truth about the people they love. That evening, I sat at the table with Dad while he picked at his dinner. You know, he only ever wanted to feel like part of the family, I said quietly. He didn't look at me. We made him feel like a burden. Still, no answer. But I knew he heard me. Because for the first time in days, his fork stopped moving. The next day, the phone rang 6 times before Dad finally picked it up. He didn't say much, just short, clipped phrases. Yes, I understand. We'll take care of it. Then he hung up and sat in silence, his fingers tapping the edge of the kitchen table like a metronome counting down to something inevitable. That was the bank, he muttered. Mom turned from the sink. And? They're sending a formal notice. We're 60 days behind already. Apparently he stopped the transfers a while ago, but it didn't hit the system until now. Mom's face lost color. How much? Dad hesitated. Over $8,000, plus fees. She sat down slowly, like her knees might not hold her. I didn't say anything. I couldn't. Because part of me, though I hated it, was glad. Glad they finally understood the size of what Grandpa had been carrying alone. That afternoon, I walked to Grandpa's house. It was about 20 minutes away, a little bungalow tucked behind an old maple tree with wind chimes by the porch. He wasn't outside, but his truck was there. I rang the bell, heart pounding harder than it should have. He opened the door wearing his usual flannel and the same kind eyes I'd always known. Hi, honey, he said softly. Didn't expect company today. Can I come in? He smiled, stepped aside, and let me in without a word. The house smelled like cinnamon and pine. There were no decorations, no signs of Christmas, just peace. In the living room, I looked at the old clock on the mantel still ticking. Above it hung a framed photo of Grandma. Next to it, a copy of my third-grade drawing, a crooked Christmas tree with me and Grandpa scrawled in crayon. I sat down. Grandpa, I know what happened. He didn't flinch, didn't even ask how I knew. Dad's scared, I added. He doesn't know how to fix it. It's not his to fix, he said gently. It never was. There was no anger in his voice, just calm. I tried to help him build a life, he continued, but somewhere along the way, he forgot it wasn't his. He forgot it came from love. I felt my throat tighten. You didn't deserve to be left out, I whispered. He looked at me, his eyes soft but firm. Emma, I didn't cancel the mortgage to punish him. I canceled it to free myself. He stood up, walked to a drawer, and pulled out a worn envelope. Inside were old receipts, bank slips, photocopies of checks. He handed it to me. I kept every record, not for revenge, but because someday, someone might want to know the truth. I held it in my hands and nodded slowly. I do, I said. I want to know everything. And that was when I realized this wasn't just a story about money. It was a story about value. And who gets to decide who's worth what in a family? When I got home that evening, I placed the envelope Grandpa had given me on my nightstand. I didn't open it again. I didn't need to know yet. What stayed with me wasn't the numbers or the receipts. It was the way he'd said, I didn't cancel the mortgage to punish him. I canceled it to free myself. It echoed like a bell in my chest. Dad didn't mention Grandpa again, but I started noticing things. He stopped playing music while making breakfast. He stared longer at the mortgage papers on the counter, and every night he paced, quiet, agitated, disconnected. On the fourth night, I found him in the garage, sitting on the step between the car and the door, just holding his head in his hands. I didn't say anything. I just stood in the doorway until he noticed me. You think I'm a bad son, don't you? He asked without looking up. It caught me off guard. I think you forgot who raised you, I said softly. He winced. I didn't mean to cut him out. You did it anyway, I replied. He looked at me then. Not angry, just tired. Smaller somehow. It wasn't supposed to be like this. I thought I was protecting the holiday, keeping things peaceful. By removing the one person who gave everything to make this home possible? He rubbed his face. I didn't think he'd care that much. He never says anything. He just shows up, helps, fixes stuff, pays bills like it's nothing. Exactly, I interrupted. He shows up, and that's more than most people ever do. Later that night, I went back to Grandpa's envelope. There was a small note tucked between the receipts I hadn't noticed before, handwritten, dated 2 years earlier. In case Emma ever asks where it all went, tell her it went toward giving her father a chance. Tell her I never regretted it, just wished he'd remembered who handed him the tools. I pressed the note to my chest. My throat burned. He hadn't been keeping score. He'd been keeping a record for me. The next morning, the phone rang again. Mom picked it up this time. I watched her face drop. Yes. No, he hasn't called yet. We'll respond by Friday. She hung up and looked straight at Dad. It's the final notice. We're going to lose the house if we don't pay. Dad didn't say anything for a long moment. Then, we'll call him. But Grandpa didn't answer. Didn't return calls. Didn't reply to texts. That silence? It wasn't revenge. It was resolve. A silence that said, you drew the line. I just stepped back far enough for you to see it. I sat with Mom that night while she sorted through boxes of old bills. You know, she said suddenly, when your father and I first moved in, your grandpa spent every weekend here for 6 months. He never said a word about it, just showed up with tools, food, even paid for the floors when our card maxed out. I stared at her. Why didn't we thank him properly? She sighed. Because we thought there'd always be more time. But time runs out. Even for the strongest ones, the quiet ones. Especially for the ones no one sees until they stop giving. And sometimes, silence becomes the loudest teacher of all. I returned to Grandpa's house 2 days later. He wasn't surprised to see me. He just opened the door, nodded once, and said, come on in. I was just in the workshop. The workshop. It was a small detached shed behind his house, with creaky steps and sawdust that smelled like childhood. I hadn't been there in years. Inside, nothing had changed. The same cracked stool by the workbench, the jars of screws sorted by size, the smell of pine, glue, and varnish. He handed me a cup of cocoa made the old-fashioned way, in a pot. No words for a minute, just the quiet hum of the space he built with his own hands. "You remember that jewelry box I made you when you were 10?" he asked suddenly. I smiled. "The one with the music ballerina? I still have it." "You picked the song, Claire de Lune." He grinned. "Had to learn how to install the spring just for that." There was something in his voice's soft pride, maybe, or longing. "Grandpa," I said gently, "why didn't you say anything that night, when Dad didn't invite you?" He put down his mug and stared at the grains in the wood table. "Because, Emma, when a man's been ignored long enough, words lose their weight." That sentence hit harder than anything he could have shouted. He reached into a drawer and pulled out a photo frame. It was dusty, old, nearly faded. Inside was a picture of my dad, maybe 10 years old, standing on Grandpa's shoulders as they finished painting a fence together. Dad was smiling, grinning like the world was his. And Grandpa was looking up at him with the kind of joy you don't stage for cameras. "I used to think," Grandpa said quietly, "that if I just gave Enoch time, money, help, he'd remember this. But somewhere along the way, I stopped being his father and became a service." I felt my throat tighten. "That's not fair," I said. "He forgot who you were." But I didn't. He looked at me, then really looked. And I saw something flicker in his eyes. Not sadness, not bitterness. Peace. "That's why I gave you the envelope," he said. "Because you're the one who might still carry the truth forward." He stood and walked to the back wall of the shed. There, beneath a tarp, was a small chest. He opened it and pulled out a stack of neatly labeled folders. "These are the payments, the checks, the home equity loan I took to cover their down payment, the taxes, the maintenance, even the repairs they never noticed." I stared at them. It was everything. All the years he gave without question. "Why keep it all?" I asked. He smiled softly. "Because love doesn't mean blindness, Emma, and someday, your father's going to tell himself a different version of this story. When he does, you'll have the truth." I didn't cry until I got home. Until I set the folders down on my bed and realized just how much one man had given, not for recognition, but for love. And how quiet that kind of love can be. Until the silence is all that's left. It was the morning of New Year's Eve when I found it tucked inside the manila folder Grandpa had handed me, wedged between utility receipts and copies of mortgage statements. A letter. Addressed in his careful handwriting. "To Emma, when you're ready." I sat on the edge of my bed and unfolded it with both hands, like it might fall apart if I didn't treat it with reverence. "My dearest Emma, if you're reading this, then I suppose the silence has lasted longer than I hoped. I want you to know that this letter isn't about blame. It's not even about money. It's about memory. Yours and mine. I built this life with my hands, not just the house, but the people inside it. I raised your father with every bit of love I had, and when he needed help, I gave it without condition. Not because I wanted something back, but because that's what we do for the ones we love. But love without respect becomes servitude. And I realized this Christmas, sitting in my truck outside a house I paid for but wasn't welcome in, that I had taught your father how to receive, but never how to see. You saw me. Even when you didn't understand everything, you saw me. And that's why I left this record with you, not to turn you against your parents, but so you would know the truth. So you could carry it forward without shame or distortion. I don't expect your father to apologize. I don't need him to. What I needed was to let goof the weight, the role, the silence. The mortgage was never really his burden. It was mine. Because I let it become a substitute for the words he wouldn't say. So I canceled it. Not to punish him, but to free both of us. If he ever asks you why, tell him this. A man doesn't need a place at the table when he's spent a lifetime building the house. But if you close the door on him, don't be surprised when the lights go out. All my love, always. Grandpa. I read it 3 times. The first time, I cried. The second time, I felt angry, not at Grandpa, but at the blindness that had lived inside our family for too long. And the third time, I understood. This wasn't about a canceled mortgage. It wasn't even about being uninvited from Christmas. It was about legacy and the cost of forgetting who carried you when you couldn't walk on your own. That night, I placed the letter in a new frame and set it on my desk. I didn't show it to Dad. Not yet. Because some truths have to be carried until the person who needs them is finally ready to receive them. But I started seeing things differently after that. I saw the chipped corners of our kitchen counter not as imperfections, but as signs of Grandpa's hands sanding and sealing. I noticed the porch light Grandpa had rewired after Dad ignored it for 2 years. I remembered the creak in the floorboard that Grandpa had reinforced with just the right plank after we all stepped over it like it wasn't our job. All the invisible labor of a man who was never loud, who never asked for praise, but who had every right to walk away. That Sunday, I returned to Grandpa's workshop. I didn't say much. I just hugged him for a long time and whispered, "I got your letter." He didn't ask what I thought. He just nodded and handed me a small wooden box, unfinished. "Want to help me build the lid?" he asked with a smile. And I did. Because I was ready to build something with him now, not out of debt or guilt, but out of love freely given. The kind that remembers. The kind that lasts. The foreclosure sign went up in early March. A simple white post on the lawn, red letters that felt louder than any argument. Bank owned, do not remove. Neighbors began whispering. Cars slowed down when they passed the house. Mom started closing the blinds even in daylight. Dad barely spoke. He moved through the house like a shadow, muttering about refinancing and missed paperwork, but never once mentioning Grandpa's name. Not out loud. But I heard it in the silences. Every time he passed the hallway photo of their wedding hung in a frame Grandpa had made. Every time the heater clicked on, and I remembered it was Grandpa who'd paid for the new system during a snowstorm 2 winters ago. One night, I found Dad sitting at the dining table in the dark, just staring at the place where Grandpa used to sit. "You know what the worst part is?" he said without looking up. "I really thought I was doing the right thing, making space, protecting my own traditions." I waited. But now the mortgage is gone, the house is gone, and the one person who gave me everything. He stopped. I don't even know how to call him. "You don't call," I said. "You show up, like he always did." He looked at me like he hadn't really seen me in months. And for the first time, I didn't feel like a kid anymore. We moved out in April. Packed our things in boxes Grandpa had stored in our garage years ago. Boxes labeled in his handwriting. A quiet irony. Dad took a job across town. Smaller house. No crown molding. No gourmet kitchen. Mom said it felt simpler. I knew she meant emptier. As for me, I started spending every Sunday with Grandpa. We didn't talk much about what had happened. He didn't bring it up. Neither did I. But every time we sanded wood together, or planted something in the yard, I felt like we were repairing more than furniture or soil. We were restoring what had been neglected. Respect. One afternoon, while organizing Grandpa's bookshelf, I found something tucked behind a row of gardening manuals. A newspaper clipping. Retired builder quietly supported son's mortgage for 5 years. It wasn't flashy. No headlines. Just a small column in the local section, written by a quiet reporter Grandpa had apparently reached out to. It listed the facts, the dates, the receipts. No names were mentioned directly, but anyone in our neighborhood who read it would know. It wasn't revenge. It was record. At dinner the next weekend, I asked Grandpa if he ever missed the house. He shrugged. "I don't miss the walls," he said. "I miss the moments I thought meant something." Then he smiled at me. "But I've got new ones now." He wasn't talking about the house. He was talking about me. About Sunday afternoons in the workshop. About shared meals that weren't transactional. About being wanted, not used. I looked around his home, modest, warm, filled with things made by hand, not bought in catalogs. There was no crown molding, no granite countertops, no illusion of status. But it had something the old house never truly had. Honor. In the end, the man who was pushed aside didn't burn the world down. He simply stopped holding it up. And when he walked away, we finally saw how much weight he'd been carrying all along. I don't know if Dad and Grandpa will ever truly reconcile. But I know this. I won't forget again. And if I ever have a daughter, I'll tell her about a Christmas long ago, where a quiet man got in his truck and drove away, and took the whole foundation with him. Looking back, I now understand what Grandpa was really teaching us. He wasn't just showing us strength through silence, he was reflecting something deeper, something eternal. In John 13, 14, 15, Jesus washed his disciples' feet not to prove his power, but to show what humble love looks like. That's what Grandpa did. He gave, served, sacrificed. And when the time came, he walked away not in bitterness, but in quiet dignity. To anyone older who's ever felt forgotten, your value isn't in what you give, it's in who you are. You are seen. You are remembered. And even if others fail to honor your presence, God never forgets faithful love. Grandpa reminded me that sometimes setting a boundary is not unkind, it's holy. It's saying, I am still God's child, and I will carry myself that way. If this story touched something in you or reminded you of someone in your life, please subscribe, leave a comment, and share what your quiet legacy has been. You matter, your story matters.